Now you talk about terror. I've been terrorized all my day. All my day.
Hi, I'm Chris Hedges. Welcome to Days of Revolt. Paul Tillich, the theologian, wrote that all institutions, including the church, are inherently demonic. The theologian Reinhold Niebuhr asserted that no institution could ever achieve the morality of the individual. Institutions, he warned, to extend their lives when confronted with collapse, will swiftly betray the stances that ostensibly define them. Only individual men and women have the strength to hold fast to virtue when faced with the threat of death. And decaying institutions, including the church, when consumed by fear, swiftly push those endowed with this moral courage and radicalism from their ranks, rendering themselves obsolete. The wisdom of Tillich and Niebuhr has been borne out in the precipitous decline of the liberal church and the seminaries and divinity schools that train religious scholars and clergy. Faced with shrinking or non-existent endowments, mounting debts, dwindling memberships, a lack of employment for their graduates, and growing irrelevancy in a society that has little use for the tepid church piety and smug arrogance that comes with it. These institutions have fallen to physical and moral decay. And here with me to speak about the decline of mainline seminaries and churches are two students from Union Theological Seminary in New York, Edward Escalon and Michael Vanacore. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happened in these mainstream denominations. We've seen, of course, incredible declines in numbers. The mainline Protestant denominations have decreased in numbers from about 41 million in 2007 to 36 million in 2014. The average age of the parishioner in the pew is 52. This has been replicated within the Catholic Church. Mainline seminaries and divinity schools have been merging or closing. What as seminary students have you been watching? What's been taking place within these institutions, Michael?
I think one of the things that we see at Union is really a failure of moral leadership. I think one of the things that happens in these institutions, like Niebuhr was saying, when you see them losing membership, losing numbers, there's an instinct to go towards self-preservation. And I think that's what happened when Union Theological Seminary decided to build a luxury condominium tower.
Right, and we should say that what's been happening in these places like Union is that for many years they've been selling off their property to stay afloat, right. Leasing. What do they have, a 900-year lease or something with one of their buildings with Columbia?
The
library. Sure. We saw General Theological Seminary in New York has sold off, I think, almost all its property, right? They have 14 students left or something. Their faculty went out and protest against this corporate-trained president. I think he was a commercial litigation lawyer for many years. He denied them tenure. And of course, as you said, we are now watching Union, which is important to remember. Union has, been at the forefront of progressive theology, whether black liberation, feminist, womanist, queer theologies all have their roots at Union. They have identified themselves with the Black Lives Matter movement, and yet they are now taking part in this gentrification process to raise. Do they know how much money they intend to raise with this?
They have said anywhere between $125 to $150 million.
Right, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what that decision means, Edward. They've built a relationship with a construction firm that has egregious charges through the subcontractors they use of wage theft and labor violence, including fatalities.
Right.
And then we have the whole issue of perpetuating that whole gentrification, driving poor people out of Morningside Heights and West Harlem.
Right. I think at Union you have this, as you say, Union has been an institution that has identified itself as being very supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what Union has said is it says that it stands as a prophetic voice to the country, and it's telling the country, leaders of faith, people of faith, you need to come out, you need to support this movement, you need to support justice making in the world. And then when you turn internally, when you look at Union internally, you see a situation where Union doesn't think that Black Lives Matter in our neighborhood or even within our institution. If you look at the way in which the institution treats its professors of color, its students of color, and its neighbors of color, you just don't, you have something, it doesn't add up.
And how do they treat them?
So we have a number of faculty at Union that are really supportive to students. They're faculty of color, but yet they have failed to receive tenure.
Well, you have the greatest theologian in America, James.
Correct. And
hands down.
we all come to Union because of those reasons. You know, I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition, the Assemblies of God. I left the Pentecostal tradition, I left the Assemblies of God because I felt that this was a tradition that was not open to women, it was not open to LGBTQ people, and where am I gonna go? What kind of seminary am I gonna go to? I can't go to Fuller. I'm not gonna go to Gordon Cromwell. Well, I Google, you know, what is the most progressive seminary?
People may not be familiar with Fuller and Gordon Cromwell. These are evangelical seminaries, Gordon Cromwell in Boston, and
Fuller in Pasadena.
Fuller in Pasadena. A lot of people don't understand this division between progressive mainline seminaries and divinity schools and places like Gordon Cromwell. These evangelical schools, which are growing and have, of course, huge corporate support because they preach the prosperity gospel, this idea that people are wealthy because God has blessed them, and if they believe in Jesus, magic Jesus will bless them as well. And a statistic that surprised me was that there are more students at Gordon Cromwell, 2,067 alone, than at the divinity schools and seminaries of Yale, Harvard, Union, Vanderbilt, and Chicago.
It's interesting that you would bring up the prosperity gospel and associated with a seminary like Gordon Cromwell. When you look at the rhetoric that's coming out of Union currently, you would think that Union itself was a seminary that promoted the prosperity gospel. We have our President Jones who's saying that we have a New York City-sized problem, but thankfully God has given us a New York City-sized solution to our financial air rights, which we're going to make millions of dollars. And it's so crazy how quickly Union, which as an institution, you would think the students and the faculty come up and they speak against the prosperity gospel, how quick they are to use prosperity gospel rhetoric to justify what they're doing right now. And if you look at Union's history, if you look at the history of mainline Protestantism, you will find there's a lot of prosperity gospel type rhetoric that's coming out of the whole positive movement. The progressive movement itself was this idea that we're getting better and we're getting stronger. And
well, that's what Karl Barth imploded, of course. But this was the engine of Rauschenbusch's social gospel that we are going to, that progress is inevitable and we're going to remake the world, and which World War I kind of was a big wake-up call to the reality of human nature and human history. Michael, how do you think this looks? What does this say about not only seminaries like Union, but the church itself?
I think this says it is a question of who we are, what our identity is. What is the church supposed to be about? So we as Christians, I came to Union because I believe that Jesus and I believe that the church is about serving the poor and liberation for the poor and solidarity with the poor and with people of color and with people that are oppressed in this society and globally. When we decide to build a luxury condominium tower in Harlem that will directly gentrify our neighborhood, will displace people, will increase the police presence, the police oppression of people of color in our neighborhood, we're choosing not to stand in solidarity with the poor or not to fight on the side of the poor. We're choosing to stand against them. And that, whether we're talking about a seminary or whether we're talking about a church, is a question of identity. Who do you choose to be? Who do we choose to be? And I think it's in moments of crisis when institutions define themselves. And I think the quote that you read at the beginning is prescient to where we are, where we see ourselves as a church deciding who we are going to be, who we are now, and who are we going to be. And I think part of the problem is, we lack faith. We lack the faith that if we hold true to who we are in our identity, even if it makes a tough decision, even if it means we might see some buildings fall down around us, even if it means we can't make a $125 million renovation, maybe it means we just limp along staying the way we are, or maybe it means we have to move and do something else. But if we have faith in what we hold to be true, that's what's important. And then we can have some kind of hope for some kind of new life.
It's about standing for something and fighting for something. And when you actually fight on behalf of the oppressed, I don't know what, divinity school President Jones went to, but it comes with a cost. At least when I read the gospel, it does come with a cost. And sometimes it even comes with a cost of your life.
Yeah. I grew up at a very poor Assemblies of God congregation out in the borderlands in California. We had a church building that was built by a bunch of Okie migrants. It was falling apart around us. And one thing that was instilled in me growing up in this church was the church is not the building. The church is the people. And we are more than the building. And you go to places like Union and you would think the church was the building. You would think that Union is the building. And that is just really disheartening. And I think you'll find mainline institutions like Union, even churches are making decisions that are hurting their neighborhoods, decisions to sell to developers, decisions to, I don't know, Union has got in its head that this $150 million renovation is what we need to survive as an institution, and they're not asking the question, well, maybe we shouldn't continue to survive as an institution the way we are. I joined the Episcopal Church recently, and I realized I'm on a sinking ship,
Right.
We're not, the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Communion, we're having issues right now, but that's something that I wholeheartedly accept. I accept that I'm in an institution that is in decline, and Union, I think Union and institutions like it are just so arrogant. They view themselves as completely 100% essential to the future of Christianity and to the future of faith in this country, when in reality, the Pentecostal churches that line 125th are probably more important to the future of faith in New York City than Union Theological Seminary is.
Well, that's, this is part of the self-destruction of liberal religious institutions, is that I think, as you correctly point out, they have blinded themselves with incredible arrogance and self-righteousness, even in the midst of palpable decline. They continue to identify with, mainstream Democratic Party type mechanisms of reform that have long ceased to work on behalf of the poor and the oppressed. And what's so interesting about the liberal church or seminaries like Union is that they find their identity in past radicalism, the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, that at the moment that those movements were struggling, were considered hostile forces by both the mainstream liberal church and Union itself. The founders of Union called abolitionism fanaticism.
Right.
Union was founded for privileged white men. And those people who actually kept the spirit of the church alive were often fighting those very forces. And yet today, there's a kind of rewriting of history, as if these institutions, the hierarchies of these institutions, have always been on the side of the oppressed.
Right.
I mean, the liberal church, in the whole build-up to mass incarceration, was as silent as the liberal white church was during lynching.
Right.
And I think that there's a kind of deep mendacity. But what's frightening is that in a moment of crisis, those radical forces, and James Cone would be an example of that I think actually hold fast to that core message of the gospel, are swiftly shunted aside because they're seen as a threat.
Yeah, or they're used as admissions material, right?
Right.
So you mentioned James Cone. There's also Dolores Williams, and there's Ada Maria Isasi Diaz. These are profound theologians who Union loves to claim and loves to put on brochures and loves to use their images, but Union doesn't tell you that these institutions gave these individuals hell. You know, these people were often writing against the things that they were seeing at Union Theological Seminary. But now, you know, we get to rewrite history and we get to say we're what made this. And in a way, Union is responsible for these individuals, but not necessarily in a positive way.
I think that's true throughout the history of the liberal church.
Right.
That all of those figures who had the courage to name the demonic nature of the institution itself, as Tillich says, were at war with those institutions. And as these institutions face the possibility of their own morbidity, they work with even more fervor to push those radicals aside, because those radicals hold fast to a moral imperative which conflicts with their what they consider to be financial necessities.
If I could say something about the Black Lives Matter movement, I was a part of a number of students. We did a lot of organizing right after the non-indictment in New York City.
This is on the Eric Garner?
Yes, around the case of Eric Garner. And we were organizing from 8030 and Union, and we were, you know, marching in the street. We did a lot of work organizing there. I actually went to St. Louis during the summer through connections that were made through that organizing. And a lot of first years now came to Union because Union sold that work as the work that Union does. However, when I first got to Union, one of the first things I did was I went to a protest at Columbia University, which was held against Columbia by people who live in the Grant and Manhattanville houses, which are projects on 125th Street. The police had recently raided those projects and locked up 40 men, a minimum of 40 young men, and put them in Rikers for 6 months at least, before even sentencing them. And those mothers of those children, those babies, were protesting Columbia because Columbia leans on the police department to police that neighborhood. And when we build, we're going to have a luxury condominium at Union Theological Seminary.
You're going to stop it.
That condominium association is going to do the same thing.
Of course.
Union does the same thing. So we say we are for Black Lives Matter, but in our neighborhood, in our corner of the world, we're about oppression of people of color. We're about oppression, displacement that will come from the rising costs. You see in Morningside Heights, between 2000 and 2012, the real apartment rent has risen 46% already, and that's because of our presence.
Right.
And we put a condominium tower there. Imagine what's going to happen. So we say that we are in solidarity with Black Lives Matter, but when the rubber meets the road, when push comes to shove, we're really on the side of the developers, because we want to be there. We want to have the nice offices and the nice buildings and nice dorms.
Smart classrooms.
The smart class. We need $125 million because we need to have smart classrooms.
And you've got homeless people sleeping outside your dormitories.
We do.
And we kicked out friends.
So there's this group called Friends by the River, which is run by Union students, and it's a weekly or monthly meal that they do for homeless people living around Riverside Church. And this group was recently told that they could no longer meet inside of Union.
Who said that?
The administration,
Of
communicated
Union?
to the leaders of the group that Friends by the River was no longer welcome. And so it's just Union's public persona and what they do within their castle are just completely different things. As a Latino at Union, it's very hard to see sometimes the way that the workers are treated. Most of the workers are people of color. And to hear about the way which the low wage workers, the people who make Union run,
Right.
and to see the way they're treated, it's very disheartening. I came from Harvard, and Harvard is not an institution known for its just, stance in the world. And I came to Union because I thought that Union would provide something different than Harvard. I didn't want to go to HDS because I
That's
wanted
Harvard Divinity School.
Right,
That's
Harvard
where I went.
Divinity School. Right, I didn't want
You
to.
made
go
a good choice there.
Oh, thank you. Mostly because I wanted to go to a seminary that cared about people.
Right.
That cared about people outside of the world, and I wanted to be in New York City where people were, and where the opportunities to do real ministry in the city are just outstanding. And when I got to Union, I found that it was all just a brochure.
So what has this taught you about the church? I mean, you're going on to be ordained, right, Michael? You're getting you're not getting an MDiv, or
No, I plan on. So I study Pentecostalism. So currently, I don't plan on serving the church in an ordained position. I hope to serve the church by the type.
What has this taught you about the church?
So I would say just, in white mainline Protestant spaces, there was a recent Pew study that came out cataloging the declines, and I think you mentioned it in your article.
Right.
But one of the places that the church is not dying, so quote unquote, is in Black and Latino spaces, in Black and Latino congregations that are growing. There are many of those congregations in New York City that are progressive, that are activists, but you wouldn't know that they exist at Union. And if we take a move that will actually further colonize the same neighborhoods where these churches are growing, that's symbolic of the way at Union we're not training Latino scholars, we're not doing a good job of training Black scholars, there's no Asians. I'm Chinese American. There's one Asian professor, but I mean, there's nobody really studying what I want to study. And we're not training the future church leaders in those denominations and in those places where the church is growing. And that's the work of the church. That's who we need to be. What we need to be doing as a seminary is training the people that are still committed to the church and training the people that are committed to the work of justice. Union is answering its identity crisis of low enrollment by basically trying to position ourselves as a think tank, a place where people of no religious affiliation can come and be happy and study, and that's wonderful. But we are a seminary first and foremost, and as a pastor in training, I believe the work is to train the pastors and the lay leaders, the people dedicated to the work of the church.
Well, it's bearing the cross.
It's bearing the cross.
And Garrow, I think, does a beautiful job in his biography of Martin Luther King, called Bearing the Cross. What that means. It's standing unequivocally on the side of the oppressed and the poor, and accepting the consequences, and understanding that when you really fight for the oppressed, you're going to end up being treated like the oppressed.
Right. And there's also a way in which, we say we're about that work, but at the same time, there are two professors. One professor is a Latino. There are like two parish pastors, I believe, that are actively serving churches who are professors at Union. And one of them that is one of the main stalwarts for Latino students, for pastors in training like myself, he doesn't have tenure.
Right. Before we close, I just want to read this quote from William Stringfellow, practiced law in Harlem in the 1950s and 60s, when he wrote of the church, "The premise of most urban church work, it seems, is that in order for the church to minister among the poor, the church has to be rich. That is, to have specially trained personnel, huge funds, and many facilities. Rummage to distribute, and a whole battery of social services. Just the opposite is the case. The church must be free to be poor in order to minister among the poor. The church must trust the gospel enough to come among the poor with nothing to offer the poor except the gospel. Accept the power to apprehend and the courage to reveal the word of God, as it is already mediated in the life of the poor. When the church has the freedom itself to be poor among the poor, it will know how to use what riches it has. When the church has that freedom, it will be a missionary people, again, in all the world." And Stringfellow repeatedly warned Christians, as well as Christian institutions, not to allow the fear of death to diminish the power of Christian witness. Faith becomes real on the edge of the abyss. In the face of death, Stringfellow wrote, live humanely. In the middle of chaos, celebrate the word Amidst babble, speak the truth. Confront the noise and verbiage and falsehood of death with the truth and potency and efficacy of the Word of God. Thank you very much, Edward and Michael.
Amen.
And thank you for watching Days of Revolt.
Had to eat out the watermelon patch. And you know they put me in a shack